Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we'll discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply affected by that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month's topic is capital punishment. This is part 2 of today's topic, and as always, we have a special guest. Will you please introduce yourself?
My name is Bill Pelkey. I'm the president and co-founder of the Journey of Hope from Violence to Healing.
Bill, why don't you tell us your story?
Well, Bob, my story goes back to May 14th of 1985. On this day, there were 4 young girls, 9th grade students at Wallace High School in Gary, Indiana. It was lunchtime. In those days, students could leave the school grounds, have lunch, and then go back to school. But on this day, these 4 girls knew they weren't going to go back to school. They were going to ditch, play hooky for the rest of the day. They went to one of the girls' homes near the school. There was nobody there but the 4 girls. And they sat around the dining room table and began to drink alcohol, smoke marijuana, and began to talk about what they're going to do for the rest of the day. They decided they'd like to play video arcade games at the local arcade a block away on Broadway, but they had a problem. They didn't have any money. And finally, the girl whose house they were at said, well, there's an old lady who lives in back of me. She teaches Bible lessons in the neighborhood. She lives alone. I think she has money. She doesn't have a dog or anything like that. She said, if you 3 girls go knock on her door, tell her to take her Bible lessons, I think she'll let you in the house. And when you get in the house, you can rob her. She said, now she'll recognize me, so I'll stay back as a lookout. And the girls agreed on that plan. A short time later, 3 of the girls went, knocked on my grandmother's door. My grandmother answered the door, and they said, Mrs. Pelkey, we'd like to take your Bible lessons. And my grandmother told the girls to come on in. And to know my grandmother, this is what my grandmother would do. When Nana turned her back to get some information on the Bible classes, one of the girls grabbed a vase off the end table and hit Nana over the head. As Nana fell to the floor, another girl pulled a knife out of her purse and began to stab Nana. And while this girl was stabbing Nana, the other 2 girls went to the house looking for money. And the girls came up with a total of $10 and the keys to Nana's old car, took her car and went back to the high school they'd skipped out on a few hours earlier to see if any of their friends wanted to go joyriding. And my grandmother died on the dining room floor of her home.
So then how did you find out and what happened next?
Well, Bob, my dad stopped by Nana's house the next day and found her body in a pool of blood. And you can imagine what a terrible thing it was for him to walk into the house that day, what it was like for our entire family that somebody we loved so much could have died such a horrendous death. The girls were arrested the next day, and immediately it came out in the paper that in the state of Indiana, at that time, if you were 10 years old or older and involved in that sort of crime, you could be charged as an adult. When the trials actually began to take place about a year later, the girl knew my grandmother was sentenced to 25 years in prison for her role in the robbery murder. The girl who was accused of hitting Nana over the head with a vase was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The last girl to go before the judge, her name was Paula Cooper. Paula Cooper is the one that brought the knife into the home, inflicted the majority of the stab wounds. She was 15 years old at the time of the murder. She also pled guilty, so there was no criminal trial, just a sentencing hearing. I went to the courtroom and I watched as the prosecution spent 2.5 hours saying why this girl should be sentenced to death. My father was a witness for the prosecution. And when he was asked what he thought the penalty should be, he pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket that had about 30 Bible references on it. And he said he felt it would be a travesty of justice if she did not get the death penalty. I watched as the defense spent an hour and a half saying why she should not get the death penalty. And then the judge gave his verdict. And I'll never forget the words of the judge that day. He started off by saying when he had graduated from Loyola Law School back in 1959, he said there was one thing that he knew for sure. He said he knew he was opposed to the death penalty. But then he said, according to the laws of the state of Indiana, he had no choice. And he sentenced Paula Cooper to death, and she became the youngest person on death row in our country.
So, Bill, you shared with us that your father quoted some Bible references and asked for the death penalty. But how were you feeling about this at that time?
Bob, that was okay with me. I knew we had a death penalty in our country. I remember as I walked out of the courtroom that day, there were television cameras present. It was a big case. And I was asked for my opinion of what had just happened in the courtroom. And I said, well, I felt like the judge did what he had to do. But then fighting back tears, I said, but it won't bring my grandmother back. And that was on July 11th of 1986. And then 3.5 months later, November 2nd, 1986, is a day I'll never forget. It's a day that changed my life.
Wow. So, Bill, what is it that happened on that date that you remember so well?
Well, November 2nd, 1986, I was at work at Bethlehem Steel. And as I sat up in my crane cab, about 50 foot up in the air, I began to reflect on Nana's life and on Nana's death. And Bob, I actually began to ask my God why. Why had he allowed one of his most precious angels to have suffered such a horrendous death? And why'd our family have to suffer as so many in our family had? As I thought about Nana, my mind went to the courtroom on the day where Paula Cooper had been sentenced to death. And I recall that just as the judge had begun to deliver the sentence of death, there was an old man sitting out in the gallery. He just began to cry and to wail very loudly, "They're going to kill my baby! They're going to kill my baby!" And the judge told the bailiff to escort the man from the courtroom because he was disrupting the proceedings. And I watched as the young man was led by me out of the courtroom, tears come out of his eyes and streaming down his cheeks. It was Paula Cooper's grandfather. And I also recalled, as Paula Cooper was led off to death row, she'd had a chance to address everybody in the courtroom. She did say she was sorry and had asked for forgiveness. But I recalled as she was led off, the tears just coming out of her eyes and streaming down her cheeks. And then, Bob, I began to picture an image of my grandmother. There had been a very, very beautiful picture taken of my grandmother shortly before her death. And whenever the newspapers did a story about her death, about the trials, about the death sentence being given, they would always show this one very beautiful picture. Try to show you. But I began to envision an image of this picture in my mind, but with one distinct difference. I envisioned tears coming out of Nana's eyes and streaming down Nana's cheeks. And I knew that they were tears of love and compassion for Paula Cooper and her family. I knew that Nana would not want this grandfather to have to go through to see a granddaughter that he loved very much, strapped into the electric chair and the volts of electricity put to her until she was dead. And I also thought about Paula Cooper. And even though Paula Cooper had brutally killed Nana, Nana had invited her and the other girls into the house because she wanted to share with her love in Jesus. And I felt that Nana would rather somebody from our family try to continue to share that same faith with her rather than seeing her put to death. I began to think about Nana's faith, the Christian faith, and I immediately thought of three things that Jesus had to say. The first thing I thought about was the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus was speaking to the multitude. And Jesus said, if you want your Father in heaven to forgive you, you need to forgive other people. I also thought about when Jesus was teaching the disciples about forgiveness. Peter questioned Jesus, how many times are you supposed to forgive? 7 times? And Jesus responded by saying, not 7, but 70 times 7. Jesus was saying forgiveness should be a habit. It should be a way of life. That we're supposed to forgive, to forgive, to forgive, and keep on forgiving. And Bob, also that night, as I sat up in the crane, I envisioned when Jesus was crucified. And I pictured that crown of thorns in his brow and the nails in his hands and his feet. And Jesus looking upward saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. And I thought to myself, Paula Cooper didn't know what she was doing. Somebody in the right mind doesn't take a 12-inch butcher knife and stab somebody 33 times. But what happened that day at Nana's house was a crazy, senseless act. And I kind of thought to myself, wow, my faith is telling me I should forgive. But I wasn't ready. But I felt I needed to try to generate some sort of compassion. I felt if I didn't at least try, and whenever I think about Nana again, I feel guilty that I hadn't tried. And I didn't want to feel guilty when I thought about Nana. So not knowing what else to do, as I sat up in my crane cab that night with tears coming out my eyes and streaming down my cheeks, I begged my God to please give me love and compassion for Paula Cooper and her family, and I prayed in Jesus' name. I began to think I could write this girl a letter. I could tell her about my grandmother. I could share my grandmother's faith with her. And I realized my prayer of love and compassion had been answered because I knew that I no longer wanted her to die, and I wanted to do whatever I could do to try to help her. And it brought a tremendous healing.
Bill, that's such a powerful story of tragedy and of violence, but then of love and forgiveness and example and conversion. So then what happens to Paula Cooper?
Before I left work that night, I made my God 2 promises. The first promise I made was any success that came into my life as a result of forgiving Paula Cooper, I would give God the honor and glory because God had touched my heart and I couldn't take credit for that. And the second promise, I promised my God I'd go through any door that opened up as a result of forgiving Paula Cooper. That was November 2nd, 1986, over 30 years ago. But I can say to this day, I've kept those 2 promises, and the doors that God has opened have been marvelous and wonderful. I contacted her attorney the next day. I got her address. I wrote her a letter, told her about forgiving her. I told her I wanted to meet with her. I told her I wanted to meet with her grandfather. And it began a correspondence that about every 10 days we exchanged letters until she eventually got off of death row.
So you want to share some of that story? So that led to this process of getting to know her and her family, and ultimately, as you said, getting her off of death row. So how did that happen?
The local newspaper was the Gary Post-Tribune. And after Nana's death, there were a lot of articles from different people around the country talking about the death penalty. Some said there should be a death penalty. Some said there shouldn't. She's too young, but a wide variety of opinions. So I just wrote a short piece, said the answer is love, prayer, and forgiveness. And I wanted to see how that would affect the dialogue that was taking place in a local newspaper. But on the very last day of February, I got a call from a journalist in Italy. She said, Mr. Pelkey, when Paula Cooper was sentenced to death, it was headlines throughout Europe, especially in Italy. She said, we don't have the death penalty here in Europe. And we're fascinated by the fact that how out of 22,000 murders that took place in the United States in 1985, by the state of Indiana was going to take a 15-year-old black girl and put her in the electric chair. She said the people there couldn't comprehend that. She told me about a group they had started called Don't Kill. It was started by two priests on November 2nd, 1986, the same day I begged God to give me love and compassion for Paula Cooper and her family. When she told me about it, 40,000 people had signed their names to petitions to send the state of Indiana to ask that Paula Cooper not be executed. She said they were going to come to Indiana, do a series of stories. They wanted to know if they could interview me. The way they found out about me was they called the Gary Post-Tribune. They said, well, the grandson of the victim wrote a letter a while back talking about forgiveness. So I got invited to go to Rome, Italy, actually on May 14th of 1987, 2-year anniversary of my grandmother's death, to be part of the big television program. And the two priests that started the organization, Don't Kill, took me all around within a 150-mile radius of Rome, speaking in high schools, colleges, various other media formats. In fact, I did something I never thought this little Baptist boy would ever do, but I found myself speaking on Vatican radio. And every time I talked about love and compassion, the healing power of forgiveness. I shared my grandmother's faith and asked people to sign petitions. And eventually, over 2 million signatures were signed to petitions to send to the state of Indiana. Pope John Paul II asked the governor of the state of Indiana to have mercy, and the legislators became very embarrassed over the international attention of Indiana's law calling for a 10-year-old to get the death penalty. When it went before the Indiana Supreme Court by a vote of 5-0, they did commute her sentence to 60 years in prison. So it was a great day for me when she was taken off of death row.
So do you have an ongoing relationship still with her? You visit her in prison to this day?
Well, one of the first things that I asked in the letter that I wrote to Paula was I said I wanted to visit with her and I wanted to visit with her grandfather. I was able to visit with her grandfather shortly before Thanksgiving. We sat there around the dining room table, looked at family photo albums, and when Paula was just a little girl, her and her sister, who would ever thought that these little beautiful girl would grow up to commit such a terrible crime? When I wrote to Paula, I told her I wanted to be able to visit with her. She told me the procedures to go about visiting. However, the Department of Corrections in the state of Indiana would not allow us to visit. And it actually took 8 years before we were able to visit for the first time. On Thanksgiving Day of 1994, I met with her for an hour because I had just met with this person that done such a terrible thing to my grandmother, but I had the kind of love for her that I believe God wants us to have for each of his creation. And to me, that was wonderful. I was able to visit with her 14 times while she was in prison. However, when she got out, she had 2 years parole, and part of her parole was she could not have contact with the victim's family, so I did not have contact with her. But she had told me that someday she wanted to join with the Journey of Hope and tell her story to young people that had also been raised very abusively, as was well documented in her case. But 2.5 weeks before her 2 years of parole was up, she committed suicide.
Wow, what a tragedy that is. So, Bill, you mentioned Journey of Hope there. So, obviously, this story led you to being the president of Journey of Hope. So, tell us about the organization and what you do.
The Journey of Hope is led by murder victim family members that are opposed to the death penalty. And we speak in high schools, colleges, churches. We travel around the country and around the world. We've been in 20 different countries now, 40 different states. But as we share our stories from violence to healing, we talk about how the death penalty has nothing to do with the healing that murder victim family members need when a loved one has been killed, but how it just continues the cycle of violence and creates more murder victim family members. And we promote forgiveness as a way to heal and restorative justice as a way to live. And as we share our stories, we're also joined by people that have loved ones on death row. We also are joined by people that have had loved ones that have been executed. They share what it was like for them and their families. And then we're joined by a unique group of people called exonerees. These are people who were sentenced to death for crimes that they didn't commit. In the modern era of the death penalty, since it was okayed in 1976, over 160 people have been sentenced to death here in the United States of America that were not guilty of their crimes. And then we're also joined by other activists like Sister Helen Prejean that have death penalty experience, and we put a human face on the issue of the death penalty. It's more than just a monster sitting there in a jail cell.
So what are some of the successes that Journey of Hope has had?
In 1998, after we became a nonprofit, our first Journey of Hope was in Texas, and we met some people there that were from Europe, And they saw this big 24-foot banner that we had lead the march. And so they asked us to go to Italy in December for a march to the Vatican to ask Pope John Paul II to make a statement about the death penalty. And then on Christmas Day, we led a march. The paper said there were 7,000 people on that march that day behind the Journey banner. When we got to the Vatican, probably about 15,000 people had already joined. And then Pope John Paul gave his Christmas address to the world. And he suddenly stopped reading his prepared text and for the first time publicly called for worldwide abolition of the death penalty. And he gave two reasons. He said the death penalty is cruel, and he said the death penalty is unnecessary. The death penalty is cruel. It's very, very cruel, not only to a person that we put into the cell until we take them out to kill them, but what we do to their family members is cruel. And the Pope also said it's unnecessary. Society has a right to be safe for people who commit terrible crimes, but we don't have to kill them. If we can send a man to the moon, then surely we can take a person who's committed a terrible crime and put them in a situation where they can't hurt anybody else. We don't have to kill them. That was one of the great moments for the Journey of Hope.
So people are interested and want to get involved and want to help promote the cause of forgiveness and healing and capital punishment in this country. What can we do?
We've been in 40 different states, 20 countries. We're coming back to Ohio in 2019. We're going to have another Journey of Hope. It's going to begin with a 3-day conference in Columbus, and then we're going to spread out to different areas of the state. So if people are interested in having a speaker, that would be great. Or if they would like to get on a list where they know the different places that we are going to be speaking at, that they can come hear some of our speakers. We have some very, very powerful speakers, very compelling stories.
So, Bill, your site can be found at www.journeyofhope.org. You can see who we are on Tour News. You can get the names of some people who might be available to come speak if that's needed, or you can contact Bill, I'm sure. How can people contact you, Bill?
Okay, the office number is 877-924, and then the word give.
If you're looking at the website, contact, call us. There's a phone number right there on the website. And of course, if you want to help Journey of Hope, there's also a Donate Now link on there, so you can donate to the organization. What's the date of that event in Columbus, by the way?
The Columbus conference will be the 11th to the 13th of October. It's in commemoration with World Day Against the Death Penalty. But we'll be having murder victim family members speak. We'll be having some politicians. We'll be having some ministers, some death row family members, some exonerees, and Sister Helen Prejean will also be part of that conference.
And you can learn more about that conference by going to journeyofhope.org. Other things that you would advise, Bill, that people can do to get involved?
Also, another thing is people can write a letter to the governor. From what I understand, a good, devout Catholic man, and Pope Francis has come out with the death penalty is unacceptable for any crime. And people just maybe write a letter and just say, hey, if you want to abolish the death penalty, we've got your back.
Is there a place that we can point people to when issues do come up related to the death penalty that legislative people locally might be voting on, that we would get an alert to let us know that this is a good time to contact your legislator about this issue? Is there a sign up that we can do for that?
Well, Ohioans to Stop Execution, OTSE.
You can see here on the screen, Ohioans to Stop Executions, OTSE.org. You can go to that website. You can join. You can take action. From here, you can get on a list, I'm sure. Let's see. We click on Take Action. At the time of the recording of this, it's particularly focused on stopping the execution of Warren Hennis. It'll keep you up to date on what's happening in the state of Ohio concerning the death penalty. And then you can contact your legislators when things come up, whatever it is. Great. Is there anything else there, Bill, that we're missing here?
The mantra of the Journey of Hope is love and compassion for all humanity. And we're convinced if you have love and compassion for all humanity, you will not want to see anybody put into the death chamber and their life taken from them. So that's the message we take wherever we go.
Great. Okay, well, thank you for all of your time you've given us today to talk about the issue of capital punishment and how we can be more forgiving and loving and what that looks like in action, even if you have lost in horrible violence a loved one at the hands of someone, that we can still offer love and forgiveness to them and protect society at the same time. As both John Paul II and most recently Pope Francis has called that inadmissible, unacceptable, unnecessary, the different words that have been used recently by popes, that we do not have to kill someone in order to protect society anymore. And that we should, because of that, be able to show love and forgiveness and mercy like Jesus does to us. So, thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Bob, for having me be part of this program, and I hope to see you when the Journey comes to Ohio in October.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website to view all the links talked about today at www.catholiccincinnati.org/being-pro-life. Thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to being with you again next time.